Somewhere in France, late in the summer of 1944, a tent, a folding table, a German officer's sitting across from an American interrogator. This man has fought in Poland, in France, in Russia. 5 years of war, and he is still alive, which by 1944 means he is very good at staying alive. They ask him what happened at Mortain, and he cannot explain it. He tells them the Americans did not fire artillery the way his training had prepared him for. He tells them there were no ranging rounds, no first shot, no warning, no walk. He tells them the fire of many batteries arrived together, in one weight, all at once. Sit with that for a second. This is a professional soldier who has been shelled by the Red Army, trying to tell his captors that something happened to him for which 5 years of war had not prepared him. What he could not have known, sitting in that tent, was where it came from. It did not come from a better gun. The Germans made better guns. It did not come from better gunners. Man for man, the Germans were better gunners, and every honest American artilleryman would have told you so. It came from a nearly bankrupt schoolhouse on the red dirt plains of Oklahoma 15 years before that morning, and from a handful of officers whose names have never been in a movie. And on the day it happened to him, the man who called it down was 21 years old. He was lying on a bare rock in Normandy. He had no water. He had a pair of binoculars, a map, and a radio that was going flat in his hands. And he was reading numbers into it in the flattest voice he could manage, because he understood that if his voice shook, the numbers would be wrong, and if the numbers were wrong, men would die in the wrong field. His name was Robert Weiss. This is what he did, and this is where it came from. August 7, 1944. A little before dawn. The rocky summit in Normandy that the American maps label 314. It is not a mountain. It is a bald shoulder of stone and thin grass rising above the town of Mortain, with almost nothing growing on it that a man could hide behind. Farmers had grazed animals there for centuries. It was not built for war. It simply happened to be the highest thing for miles, and from it you could see every road that mattered in western France. On that summit, behind a low wall of loose stones, Weiss lay on his stomach with a radio handset pressed against his ear. He had been there since before first light. What he could see was the valley, and in the valley, moving along the road below him in the gray fog, were German tanks. He did not know how many. He did not know whose. He did not know that the armored columns grinding forward under his binoculars represented very nearly every tank the German army could still put in motion in western France. He did not know that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered this attack over the objections of the men who would have to carry it out. He did not know that British code breakers at Bletchley Park had read German radio traffic hours earlier and pushed a warning up the chain to General Omar Bradley, and that the warning had arrived too late for anything except what was already happening. Weiss knew smaller things, truer things. He knew the infantry battalion he was attached to, 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, about 700 men, was surrounded. He knew the battalion commander was somewhere on the far side of the German lines and could not reach them. He knew a captain named Reynold Eriksson had taken over the defense of the hill on his own initiative, with a patchwork of riflemen who were low on food, lower on water, and running out of radio batteries. And he knew that the object in his hand, a signal corps radio set, powered by batteries already partly drained when they carried them up the slope, was the only thing standing between those 700 men and an SS Panzer division. Beside him was the other observer, First Lieutenant Charles Bartz, 26 years old, from Nebraska, the older of the two, the one who had been doing this longer. 2 men with binoculars, a map, and a dying radio on a bare rock in the fog. Below them, the German columns kept coming. Now hold that image, because to understand what happened on that hill over the next 6 days, you have to understand what the men in those German columns were about to experience. And why, of all the things that killed them in that war, this was the one they could never explain afterward. When the shells started arriving, they arrived wrong. That is the phrase that keeps surfacing in the German accounts. Wrong. Not heavier than what they had known. Not louder. German officers who had fought in the Eastern Front had been under Soviet artillery, and Soviet artillery was the heaviest concentration of guns on Earth. They had been shelled by the British. They had shelled others for 5 years. These were professionals. They knew what artillery was supposed to feel like. Artillery was supposed to announce itself. Everywhere in the world, in every army, an observer who spotted a target walked his shells onto it. Another round, correct again. Then, when the math was right, the battery fired for effect. That ranging process took time, and that time was the gift the system gave to the men on the receiving end. The first round was a warning. Men in a column heard it, and they had seconds, sometimes a minute, to get off the road, into a ditch, behind a wall, under a vehicle. Veterans survived by knowing exactly how much time that first round bought them. At Mortain, there was no first round. There was no build, there was no walk. There was a single enormous simultaneous impact that covered a stretch of road all at once, from multiple directions, and then silence, and then it happened again, somewhere else. Officers in the lead vehicles did not have time to give the order to scatter, because the order and the shells occupied the same second. That officer in the interrogation tent was not the only one. The same description turns up again and again across the transcripts. Words from different men in different sectors. This is the story of why, by the late summer of 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had come to believe something their own doctrine told them was impossible. That American artillery could not be survived if it caught you in the open. And it is the story of why that belief was, for a specific set of technical and organizational reasons, that most of those Germans never worked out, very close to correct. It is also a story whose beginning is nowhere near Normandy. It begins in a dusty classroom on the southern plains of Oklahoma in the late 1920s, where a major named Carlos Brewer looked at how every army on Earth was doing artillery and decided that every army on Earth was doing it wrong. But that comes later. First, why the Germans were on that road at all. 13 days before Weiss lay down behind his stone wall, the American army had broken out of Normandy. For 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allies had been stuck in the hedgerow country south of the beaches. Every field in that landscape was bordered by an earthen bank grown thick with roots. A wall a tank could not climb and a man could not see over. Every hedge was a separate fortress. The Americans measured progress in hundreds of meters and paid for it in casualties nobody had budgeted for. Operation Cobra was General Omar Bradley's answer. Pick a narrow strip of front, roughly 6 kilometers wide. Concentrate an unprecedented weight of bombers and guns on it. Then push infantry and armor through the hole. On the morning of July 25, 1944, that strip of ground stopped being ground. We will come back to Cobra in detail, because Cobra is where the German army on the Western Front first understood what it was actually fighting. For now, only the outcome matters. The German defense in the Hargegut Strip was destroyed. The line behind it cracked. Within 72 hours, the breakout was effectively over, and General George Patton's Third Army was activated and sent pouring south through a narrow corridor at the coastal town of Avranches. An army that had been moving 300 meters a day was suddenly moving 30 kilometers a day. That corridor at Avranches was a bottleneck. Everything Patton had, every tank, every truck, every fuel drum was flowing south through it. And a bottleneck is a temptation. If the Germans could cut the corridor, they could cut Patton's army off from its supply and strand its armor. If they could not, France was lost in weeks. Hitler ordered them to cut it. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, opposed it. His professional judgment was that pulling armor out of the line to attack westward would only feed it into open country under Allied air power and Allied guns, and leave nothing to hold the rest of the front. He was overruled. The operation was named Lüttich, the German name for Liège, a city that had fallen to German arms in 1914. It was meant to be a talisman. General Hans von Funk's XLVI Panzer Corps would lead it. 4 panzer divisions were committed: the 2nd Panzer, the 116th Panzer, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, with elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division attached. Roughly 150 tanks and assault guns in the opening assault, with more arriving piecemeal. They would strike west through the crossroads town of Mortain and drive to the sea. And here is the thing worth sitting with. 13 days earlier, at Cobra, German armor had been broken in the open by concentrated American firepower. The lesson of that morning was written in the wreckage. Hitler's response to that lesson was to order 4 panzer divisions onto open roads in the same country against the same army. Von Kluge knew. He said so. He was ordered to proceed anyway. The attack jumped off just after midnight on August 7 in darkness and heavy fog. There was no preparatory bombardment. Surprise depended on total silence. The German plan assumed that the American unit holding Mortain, the 30th Infantry Division, had only just moved into the sector and would be caught unready. That assumption was correct. The 30th had taken over from the 1st Infantry Division 2 days earlier. The men had not had time to dig properly. They were exhausted. And this was the same division that had been bombed by its own aircraft during Cobra 13 days before. But the Germans made one mistake in their calculation, and it was not a mistake about the 30th Division. It was a mistake about a hill. That afternoon, hours before the attack, Bletchley Park decoded a German signal. It came from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and it was a request for Luftwaffe support ahead of its advance the following morning. Think about what that signal actually was. Before a single German tank moved, an SS Panzer Division was asking for air cover over ground it had not yet crossed, and in doing so, it told the Allies the attack was coming. The decrypt reached Bradley's headquarters only a few hours before midnight. It was too late. Too late to reposition divisions, too late to reshape the defense, too late for anything that required moving large numbers of men in the dark. The most that could be done was to pass the word down to the artillery battalions. Be ready. And that is the first turn in this story. The greatest intelligence achievement of the war, the ability to read the enemy's mail, delivered a perfect warning that arrived with almost no time left to use it. Bletchley told Bradley exactly what was coming. History did not give him the hours to do anything about it, which meant the next decision was his alone. Bradley had an option that a careful commander would have taken. The 30th Infantry Division was sitting in a salient. A bulge pushed out into ground the Germans were about to attack in force. It was tactically exposed. It was held by a division that had been in place for 48 hours. Doctrine, prudence, and any reasonable reading of the map argued for pulling back to a shorter, safer line and letting the German attack spend itself against depth. Bradley did not pull back. Bradley had moved up to 12th Army Group on the 1st of August. Below him, 1st Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. Below that, 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins. And at the bottom of that chain, the 30th Division's commander, Major General Leland Hobbs. What came down that chain to Hobbs came down to one word: hold. Understand what that decision actually was. Bradley was not being stubborn, and he was not gambling on infantry courage. He was making a technical judgment. He believed that the weight of American artillery in that sector, combined with the terrain, combined specifically with the fact that observers on Hill 314 could see every road the Germans would have to use, would break the attack before it reached Avranches. He was betting the campaign in France on a fire control system. No German commander in the same position could have made that bet, because no German commander had that system. That is not a just judgment about nerve. is a judgment about what each man had available to him when he looked at his map. Bradley turned out to be right, but on the night of August 6, it was still a bet, and the chips were 700 men on a bare rock. On that rock, Weiss and Bartz had set up their observationals barely a day before. They had chosen their position the way artillery observers always choose, not for cover, but for sight. Cover would have meant a slope, a tree line, a fold in the ground. They took the summit because the summit could see. Every road running into Mortain, from the east, the south, and the north, lay open beneath them like a diagram. Around them, the riflemen of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, scraped shallow holes into stone. Multiple American artillery battalions lay within range of that hill. The exact count varies from account to account, and corps guns could be added on top of them. The only reliable link between all of that firepower and the ground it needed to hit was one radio on one summit, running on batteries that were already going flat. The fog was already there when the tanks came out of it, just after midnight. The battalion was cut off within hours. Its commander was on the other side of the encirclement and could not get back. A company commander, Captain Reynold Eriksson, stepped into the gap, took command of what remained, and organized a perimeter on the rock. And Weiss picked up the handset and began to read numbers. He would keep doing it for 6 days. He would do it while the water ran out. He would do it while the wounded lay in the open with no morphine, because there was no way to bring morphine up a hill that Germans held on every side. He would do it while the battery meter dropped, knowing that when the radio died, every gun within range would go blind and 700 men would be alone. He would do it, and the German columns below him would keep discovering, road by road and hour by hour, that there was no first round. Here is what those Germans could not work out, lying in the ditches, waiting for the fire to stop. There was no spotter aircraft above them. The fog was too thick. There was no line of sight from any gun position to the road they were on. There was no pattern to the timing they could learn, no ranging shot to run from, no rhythm to survive by. And yet the shells came down on exactly the stretch of pavement they occupied, from batteries kilometers away, within minutes of them arriving there. They assumed it was luck, then they assumed it was numbers, then they assumed it was some new weapon. It was none of those things. It was a 21-year-old with binoculars, a map, and a radio connected to a room full of men with printed cardboard strips, running a procedure that had been invented in a nearly bankrupt Oklahoma schoolhouse 15 years earlier by officers whose names almost nobody knows. And the strangest part, the part that would take the German officer corps until after the war to admit in writing, was that none of it came from being better at artillery. Because the thing coming down on them had stopped being a contest of gunnery at all. August 7, 1944, mid-morning. The fog on Hill 314 did not lift so much as thin, the way steam thins off a field in late summer, and as it thinned, Robert Weiss began to see how completely they were surrounded. There were Germans on the road to the east, Germans in the orchards south of town, Germans working around the northern shoulder of the hill. Mortain itself, the little stone crossroads town at the base of the slope, had changed hands in the dark and was no longer American. Behind the hill, where relief should have come from, there was nothing but more Germans, 700 men on a bare rock, with the enemy on every compass point. Weiss put the handset to his mouth and read out another set of coordinates. Somewhere back beyond the ridgeline, in a tent or a farmhouse room, a man he could not see wrote the numbers on a map board. Another man ran a finger down a printed strip of cardboard. A third man spoke into a field telephone. And 90 seconds later, or 2 minutes or 3, the road below Hill 314 came apart. Not one battery. Not a walking line of impacts marching toward a target. All of it everywhere at once. To the Germans in that valley, it looked like sorcery. It was not sorcery. It was a procedure, and the procedure had been invented by men who never fired a shot in that war in a place about as far from Normandy as it is possible to get and still be on Earth. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 928. If you had driven onto that post in the late 1920s, you would not have thought you were looking at the future of warfare. You would have thought you were looking at a place the Army had forgotten, the southern plains. Red dirt, wind that never stops. A collection of low buildings baking under an enormous sky with the Wichita Mountains humped up on the horizon like something left over from an older world. A handful of students, almost no guns. A budget that a single modern division would have laughed at. The Field Artillery School existed at Fort Sill, mostly because the Army had to put the school somewhere. America in 1928 was not building an army. America in 1928 was building automobiles and radios and washing machines, and the men who had come home from France in 1919 had gone back to farms and factories and did not want to hear another word about the subject. The Army was small, poor, and unfashionable. An officer who stayed in it during those years was a man who had accepted that he would probably never be rich and probably never be famous. What Fort Sill had, instead of money, was a major named Carlos Brewer. Brewer was born in 1890 in a small farming community in Kentucky. He went to West Point and graduated in 1913, 15th in his class, and then spent most of the 1920s doing the sort of quiet staff work that does not produce generals quickly. He came to Fort Sill in 1928 as an instructor. He arrived with a conviction and a small circle of instructors around him who shared it. They believed that every artillery officer in the world was thinking about the problem backwards. Here is the problem. It is the oldest problem in gunnery, and it had never been solved. From the moment guns began firing at targets the gunner could not see with his own eyes, from the 1860s onward, artillery had been split in half. The man at the gun did not know where the enemy was. The man at the front who could see the enemy did not know how to tell the gun. Every army solved it the same way. You assigned a battery to an infantry unit. You gave that battery a sector of ground. When something moved in the sector, an observer at the front walked the shells onto it, one round at a time, correcting by voice or by telephone wire. Fire. 200 left. Fire, add 100. Fire, now. Fire for effect. It worked. It was slow and it worked, and slow was accepted as a law of nature. The reason it was slow was structural. Every gun on the battlefield was, in effect, a private contractor working for one customer. If something big appeared and you wanted more guns on it, your request had to travel up a chain of command, be evaluated, be approved, be routed sideways to another unit, and then be calculated from scratch by gunners who had never heard of your target and had no data on it. By the time all of that finished, the target had moved, or it had become a different target, or it was simply gone. The Germans accepted this. The French accepted it. The Russians accepted it, and simply built more guns than anyone else on Earth. The British were the exception, and honesty requires saying so.
The Royal Artillery had built a genuinely fast system for concentrating fire, a regiment's worth of guns onto a target in about 3 minutes, and larger concentrations on call, and they had been firing simultaneous impact missions of their own in North Africa from 1942.
Anyone who tells you the Americans invented massed artillery is selling you something. What the Americans built was different in a narrower and more decisive way, and we will come to exactly what that difference was. But start with the older problem, because it is the one everybody inherited. The one time anyone had massed artillery on a truly enormous scale, the great set-piece bombardments of the First World War. It had taken days of preparation and rigid timetables that could not be changed once the battle started. You planned the fire, and then the fire happened whether or not the war had cooperated with your plan. Brewer and his instructors looked at all of this and said something that sounds obvious now and was close to heresy then. The gun is not the unit of artillery. The target is the unit of artillery. Think about it from the target's point of view. A German column on a road does not care which battery is shooting at it. It does not care about unit boundaries or organizational charts or which infantry regiment those guns were assigned to support. It cares about exactly three things: how many shells arrive, how fast they arrive, and whether there is time to get off the road before they do. So if you could find a way to make every gun within range fire on the same target at the same time, regardless of who those guns belonged to, you would produce something no army on Earth had ever produced. You would not be firing a fire mission. You would be producing a single event. In the spring of 1931, Brewer put it on the ground. He took an entire battalion of guns, dispersed across a wide training area, and massed their fire onto one target in one concentrated strike. It was not an original idea in the abstract. Other armies had thought about massing fire. The difference, and this is the difference that would eventually kill tens of thousands of German soldiers, was that Brewer was not trying to prove it could be done by a brilliant officer on a good day. He was building a system to make it routine, repeatable, fast, teachable. Something that did not depend on the genius of any particular battery commander, because Brewer understood something about the army he served that the German officer corps never understood about theirs. If a war came, his gunners would not be professionals. They would be whoever showed up. The man who turned Brewer's demonstration into an institution was the next director of the gunnery department, a major named Orlando Ward. Ward developed the Fire Direction Center. It is worth being precise about what that was, because it is the single most important object in this entire source story, and it does not photograph well. It was not a gun. It was not a vehicle. It was not a weapon in any sense a museum could display. It was a room, a plywood room at Fort Sill. In combat, a tent or a farmhouse kitchen or the back of a truck. Inside it, a map, a radio, a telephone switchboard, a few tables, and a small team of officers and enlisted men whose only job on Earth was to take one call from one forward observer and convert it within minutes into firing data for every battery within range. One call in, dozens of guns out. That was it. That was the whole invention. A room where the thinking happened, so that the men at the guns did not have to think, and the man at the front did not have to know how. Ward would go on to command the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia. He would be relieved by George Patton after the fighting at McNassie in the spring of 1943, a hard, ugly end to a combat command. He came home, and what he came home to was Fort Sill, where he served out the war as the school's commandant, running the institution that taught the thing he had helped build. There was one piece still missing. And it was the piece that decided everything: speed at the gun. The Fire Direction Center could decide in a minute that 8 batteries should fire on a crossroads. But each of those batteries still had to convert that order into an actual elevation and deflection for actual steel tubes. And that calculation was not simple arithmetic. It involved range, powder temperature, air density, wind at multiple altitudes, the rotation of the Earth, the altitude difference between gun and target, and the slow wearing out of the inside of the barrel with every round fired. Done properly, from scratch, by a trained gunner, that was 15 minutes of work. 15 minutes is a lifetime. 15 minutes is the German column arriving, passing, and disappearing over the next ridge. In the early 1940s, a small team at Fort Sill, the names most often given are Abet Burns and Major George Keyser, produced the answer. It was called the graphic firing table. It was a printed strip of cardboard. That is all it was. Slide rule-like strip you could hold in one hand with pre-computed curves printed on it, covering every combination of range, weather, powder, temperature, altitude, and barrel wear that a gun was likely to encounter. Instead of 15 minutes of ballistic computation, a gunner read his data straight off the printed strip in under a minute. The Americans had taken the most difficult intellectual task on the battlefield and turned it into a lookup. but somebody had to compute the curves that got printed on those strips. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, in a set of rooms most people have never heard of, hundreds of women sat at desks with mechanical calculators and slide rules and did it by hand. They were called computers, not the machines, the women. That was the original meaning of the word. A computer was a person who computed. Most of them were mathematics graduates from women's colleges on the East Coast, hired on civilian contracts, because the men who would otherwise have done the work had been drafted. They were young. They were, by any measure, some of the best trained mathematical minds in the country, and their work was to grind out ballistic trajectories, one at a time, by hand. One trajectory, one shell, one set of atmospheric conditions, roughly 20 hours of work. Aberdeen produced thousands of them. Later in the war, some of these same women would be retrained to program ENIAC, the first general-purpose electronic computer, which had been built in part for exactly this purpose. Their names would eventually be recovered by historians decades after the fact. But here is the part that matters for Hill 314. The graphic firing tables in the hands of American gunners in Normandy in August 1944 had been computed before ENIAC existed. They had been computed by women sitting at desks in Maryland with mechanical adding machines. So when Robert Weiss spoke coordinates into a handset on a rock in France, and steel came down on a German column 90 seconds later, there was a chain running backward from that impact, through the fire direction center, through the printed cardboard strip in a gunner's hand, back across the Atlantic to a desk in Aberdeen where a young woman had spent 20 hours on the mathematics of one shell's flight through the air. She never knew which shell, she never knew which road, she never knew about the hill. That is what the German army was actually fighting. And now we come to the turn, the thing that the German officer corps could not accept and could not explain, and in most cases could not even bring themselves to write down clearly after the war. Look at the hardware first, because that is where everyone looks. The standard American light howitzer, the 105 millimeter M2A1, was a good weapon. So was the German 105 millimeter light Feldhaubitze 18. Neither had a decisive edge in range or shell weight. The American 155 millimeter long Tom was excellent, and there were never enough of them to explain anything. The German 88, turned on ground targets, remained the most feared direct-fire weapon of the war. The hardware does not explain it. Now look at the men. The German artillery officer corps was probably the best in the world, man for man. A German battery commander had come up through years of professional formation, 5 years, 7 years, a decade of grounding in gunnery as a craft. He could estimate, judge, and correct in his head. He was an artisan in the true sense of the word, and he had been trained by a tradition that went back to Frederick the Great. Now look at who was on the American side of the line in 1944. In 1939, the entire United States Army had fewer than 200,000 men. Not the artillery branch. The whole army. It ranked somewhere below Romania. By 1944, it had more than 8 million. The field artillery branch expanded at a rate no professional army would have attempted, and it did it by taking in whoever the country had. Farm boys from Iowa who had been figuring seed yields and acre math in their heads since they were 12. Accountants from Chicago, engineers from Pittsburgh, school teachers from Alabama, men who had spent the Depression fixing tractors and running feed store ledgers and doing the ordinary quantitative work of ordinary American life. 12 weeks at Fort Sill or Fort Bragg, handed the graphic firing tables and the radio procedures, sent to war. This should not have worked. By every rule of military tradition, it should have been slaughtered by professionals. Here is why it wasn't. And this is the heart of the whole thing. The American system was designed for amateurs. That was not a compromise. That was the design goal. The graphic firing table did not require a gunner who could do ballistics in his head. It required a gunner who could read printed instructions carefully and not make mistakes. The Fire Direction Center did not require a battery commander with a judgment of 20 years. It required a small team following a procedure. The radio net did not require virtuosity. It required discipline. The German gunner, trained for 7 years, could do things with his own gun that no American could match. But he was one man doing one thing at one gun. The American gunner, trained for 12 weeks, was one node in a network of hundreds of men, each performing a simple operation. And those simple operations added up at the level of the battlefield to something the German army could not replicate, no matter how good its individual officers were. The Germans were fighting men who were worse at artillery and losing. The same logic showed up everywhere you looked in the American system. From 1942 onward, the Americans attached small unarmed aircraft to their artillery battalions. Piper L-4s, called grasshoppers, light civilian-derived airplane as fabric over tube, slow enough that a determined man could nearly outrun one on a bicycle. The pilots were artillery officers. Their only weapon was a radio. They flew low and slow behind American lines, looking down into the German rear where no ground observer could ever see, and they talked directly to the Fire Direction Center. Not to a headquarters, not up a chain, directly. The Germans had observation aircraft too. They used them for reconnaissance and for correcting the fire of one battery. The Americans used the Grasshopper as a flying node of the entire network, which meant a German battalion moving on a road 10 kilometers behind its own front, believing itself safely out of reach, could find Corps artillery landing on it 5 minutes after some lieutenant in a light plane happened to glance down. And then there was the piece the Germans almost never understood at all: the liaison officer. Every American direct support artillery battalion sent forward observers into combat with the rifle companies, roughly one per company. That alone was more observers than a German division fielded. But the battalion also sent an officer to live at the infantry regiment's headquarters, permanently. An artillery officer, junior but experienced, whose entire job was to sit in on the infantry's planning and anticipate what they were going to need shot at before anyone asked. So when a patrol came back and reported a suspected enemy position, the liaison officer was already transmitting coordinates to the Fire Direction Center while the patrol leader was still finishing his report. To that infantry regiment, it felt like having their own private artillery. In every way that mattered to them, they did. The German infantry captain calling for fire could wait 15 minutes on a good day. On a bad day, he could wait all day. And here's where the British comparison lands, because the British could mass fire fast too. What they did not have in the same density was this: an observer with almost every rifle company, a permanent artillery officer living inside the infantry regiment's headquarters, a light aircraft overhead wired straight into the Fire Direction Center, and behind all of it, an ammunition supply that never asked a battery commander to think twice. The Americans did not have a better idea than the British. They had the same idea, wired into more places, with more shells behind it. That is one half of the answer. The other half is what had happened to German artillery in the same period. And this is the part the German generals wrote around in their memoirs and almost never wrote about directly. They had entered the war with a first-class artillery arm, superb guns, excellent officers, a tradition second to none. 3 things killed it. The first was mobility, and it is stranger than most people realize. In 1944, roughly 80% of German infantry division artillery was still drawn by horses. Horses. In the 5th year of the war, the army that had invented the Blitzkrieg, that had put its name on the idea of mechanized speed, was still moving the majority of its divisional guns with animals. The panzer divisions had motorized artillery, but the panzer divisions were a minority, and by the second half of 1944, most of their vehicles had been destroyed, requisitioned, or could not be fueled. An American infantry division could displace an entire artillery battalion, pack up, move, and be ready to fire again in under 3 hours. A German infantry division could not reliably move its guns at the speed its own infantry was being forced to fight. The guns arrived where the front had been. The second was ammunition. The United States outproduced Germany in artillery ammunition by a margin no German commander could plan around. And this is the part that mattered more. It could actually get that ammunition to the gun. Production is a factory problem. Delivery is a truck problem. The Americans had solved both. The German High Command had been warning its field commanders since 1943 that shells must be rationed. At Anzio, the most extreme documented case, the tonnage ratio on the battlefield ran on the order of 10-1 against them. Think about what rationing does to a gunner's mind. It is not just fewer shells. It is a battery commander looking at target he knows he should engage and doing arithmetic about whether it is worth the expenditure and hesitating. Hesitation is the thing. Hesitation is what the Americans had engineered out of their side of the line. And Anzio deserves a moment here because Anzio is where the American artillery branch first proved to itself that the whole idea worked. The Allied beachhead south of Rome, put ashore in January 1944, came within very little of being pushed back into the sea during the German counterattacks that February. Men who were there described it as the most frightened they had been in the war. There was no depth. There was nowhere to fall back to. There was the sea. What stopped those counterattacks, and the official American histories say this plainly, was massed corps artillery. German attacking divisions ran into concentrations of fire that were heavier and shifted from target to target faster than anything they had met on the Russian front. American Fifth Army records from that period describe fire missions in which 12 to 18 battalions were brought onto a single German concentration within minutes of it being spotted. 12 to 18 battalions on one target within minutes. The attacks failed. The beachhead held, which is why Bradley's decision on the night of August 6 was not really a gamble. Anzio had already answered the question 5 months earlier. In the worst defensive crisis the American army had faced in the Mediterranean, Mortain was not the experiment. Mortain was the proof. The third thing that killed German artillery went deepest, and it is the one that should make anyone who has ever worked inside a large organization wince in recognition. By the second half of the war, decisions about German artillery were being pulled upward. The flexible, trust-based system that a well-trained German battery commander was supposed to operate had been overridden by the same pattern of micromanagement that had hollowed out the rest of the Wehrmacht's command culture. Major concentrations required approval at higher and higher levels. Ammunition expenditure had to be justified in writing. Battery commanders who in 1940 had been trusted to read their own situations and fight their own guns increasingly found themselves waiting for permission from a headquarters that had never seen the target and never would. Now put the two systems side by side because they are exact mirror images. The Americans pushed authority down. A second lieutenant in his early 20s, lying behind a stone wall with a dying radio, could bring the fire of an entire corps of guns onto a piece of ground the size of a farmyard, on his own authority in 3 minutes. The Germans pulled authority up. A German battery commander, in many cases, could not fire a significant mission without clearance from 3 levels above him. Slower guns, fewer shells, tighter permission, against a system that was faster, better supplied, and had deliberately handed its trigger to the man who could actually see. That gap did not open gradually. It opened on top of them all at once, every time. And this is why the German accounts sound the way they do. An American barrage was not bigger than what they had known in Russia. It was shaped differently. It came all at once, with no warning. And when they moved, it moved with them. That last part is what broke people. A veteran survives by learning the enemy's rhythm. There was no rhythm to learn. You could not outweight it because it did not run on a timetable. You could not outrun it because the man watching you was already talking. There was no correct behavior. There was no skill that helped. It is worth stopping for a moment on who was down there on those roads. They were not the caricature. A German panzer grenadier in Normandy in August 1944 was, on average, a man in his 20s who had been at war since he was a teenager, who had been moved from the east to the west because the east had chewed his divisions to pieces, and who had been told at midnight to get on a road and drive toward the sea. He had done everything his training told him to do. He had spaced his vehicles. He had watched the sky. He had moved in the dark because the dark was safe, and none of it helped because the rule he had learned to survive by no longer applied and nobody had told him. That is worth holding on to because it is easy, 80 years out, sitting somewhere comfortable, to describe what happened on those roads as a machine working properly. It was. It was also a lot of young men dying in ditches without ever understanding what was killing them. Back on Hill 314, the days began to run together. August 8, August 9, August 10. The Germans came up the slope and were driven back. They came up again. Between attacks, the shelling. Between shellings, the thirst. Water was the enemy nobody talks about. There was no spring on that summit. The men had what they carried up, and then they had nothing, and it was August, and the sun on bare rock in Normandy in August is not merciful. Men licked condensation off the inside of their helmets. They took water from the canteens of the dead, and there were enough dead by then that this mattered. The wounded lay in the open. There was no morphine left. There was no plasma. There was no way to carry a man off a hill that was surrounded on all sides, which meant that a wounded man on Hill 314 stayed exactly where he fell, in the sun, for as long as it took. 2 artillery officers watched this while continuing to read numbers into a radio. On the 10th and 11th, the Americans tried something desperate. They took M84 smoke shells, hollowed them out, packed them with plasma and morphine, and fired them onto the hill. Picture the meeting where that idea was approved. Picture the ordnance men working on it. It mostly failed. Most of the shells broke apart on impact. Most of the medicine was destroyed. It is important not to smooth that over, because it tells you what those days actually were. The most sophisticated artillery organization on Earth, the network that could put the fire of a corps on a farmhouse in 3 minutes, could not reliably deliver a syringe of morphine to men 800 meters away. They could send steel with perfect precision. They could not send mercy at all. And underneath everything, the batteries were dying. That radio had come up the hill with cells already partly drained. Every transmission cost something. Weiss and Bartz began managing power the way the riflemen managed water, hoarding it, rationing it, timing transmissions, going silent when silence could be afforded. Because everyone on that summit understood the arithmetic. When the radio died, the hill went blind. Every battalion within range would go from precise to useless. The roads below would open, and 700 men, by then a good deal fewer than 700, would be alone on a bare rock with an SS Panzer division at the bottom of it. The most advanced fire control system in the world, the product of 15 years of American ingenuity, ran on a battery you could hold in 2 hands, and it was going flat. Before we go up that hill for the last time, one more thing has to be said, because a story that only shows the machine working is not an honest story. That autumn, the American Army ran out of shells. Not entirely, but badly enough. Through the fall of 1944, the European theater faced a genuine ammunition crisis, and batteries were placed under daily expenditure limits, some rounds per gun per day, and no more. The men who had spent 1944 learning that they could always call for fire discovered that sometimes now the answer was no. The system also killed its own. In the Hurtgen forest that same autumn, American shells burst in the treetops above American infantry and rained fragments down on men who had done everything right. Ground that dense turned the physics of artillery against whoever was underneath it, and the men underneath it were frequently American. And the towns paid. Mortain, the little stone crossroads that gave this battle its name, was substantially destroyed. So were dozens of Norman and Belgian towns by fire called in by men who had no realistic alternative and no illusions about what it did to the buildings and the people in them. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the artilleryman who had built the American Army's training system, the architect of the whole force, was killed by American bombs at Saint-Lô on July 25, 1944, during Cobra. 13 days before Hill 314, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater, killed by his own side's aircraft 13 days before the system he had built saved a campaign. None of that is a footnote. All of it is the same story. The thing the Germans could not survive was not clean, and the men running it knew that better than anyone. By the evening of August 11, the fifth full day, the men on Hill 314 had been under attack for over 100 hours. They had no water, little ammunition. The wounded were dying of thirst and shock as much as of their wounds. The radio was nearly gone. And down in the valley, the German columns were doing something the men on the hill could not yet interpret. They had stopped moving west. August 12, 1944. The men on Hill 314 heard it before they understood it. For 6 days, every sound that came up that slope had been a sound to be afraid of. Engines meant tanks. Voices meant infantry working around the flanks. Even silence had been dangerous, because silence meant somebody was getting into position. Then, on the sixth morning, the noise came from the wrong direction. It came from the west, from behind them, from the side where there had been nothing but Germans since the tanks came out of the fog on the 7th. The 1st Battalion of the 320th Infantry, from the 35th Infantry Division, had fought its way up through the low ground and broken through to the hill. There is no cinematic moment here. That is worth saying plainly because the movies have trained us to expect one. There was no cheering, there was no flag. What happened was that American soldiers walked onto a rock that smelled like death and found men who had been in the sun for 6 days without water, sitting among their own wounded, too dehydrated to stand up quickly. Of roughly 700 men who had gone onto that summit, somewhere between 277 and 300 were dead or wounded. The precise number varies depending on which record you read and how the count was taken, and it is worth being honest that the historians have not fully settled it. What is not in dispute is the shape of it. Something close to half the battalion was gone. The men who could walk came down off the hill. Robert Weiss came down with them, 21 years old, carrying a radio that had almost nothing left in it. Charles Bartz came down too. Neither of them understood yet what those 6 days had actually done. It would take decades for that to come clear, because the thing that mattered was not the hill. It was a road in a valley below it that the German army had needed and could not use. Here is what had actually happened while those men were dying of thirst on a rock. Operation Luttich had failed completely. The armored columns that jumped off in the fog on August 7 never reached Avranches. They never came close. The 2nd SS Panzer Division took Mortain town and could not exploit it. The 2nd Panzer made some initial ground and then stalled. The 116th Panzer barely got moving at all. And once the fog burned off on the 7th, Allied fighter bombers came down on the roads as well, Typhoons and P-47s, and the pilots reported enormous destruction. Now, a piece of honesty that most tellings of this story leave out. Allied operational research teams went out onto that battlefield afterward and counted the German wrecks by hand. They walked the roads with clipboards. And what they found was that the number of tanks actually destroyed by air-launched rockets was far, far smaller than the pilots had claimed in good faith from 300 feet at 200 miles an hour. That is not a knock on the pilots. Every Air Force in that war overclaimed, because a man in a diving aircraft genuinely cannot tell a burning tank from a smoking one. But the counting parties on the ground found something more important than a corrected number. They found that the German columns had been stopped less by destruction than by paralysis. Vehicles abandoned intact, columns halted and dispersed into fields. Attacks that dissolved not because the tanks were dead, but because the men around them could not move on a road, could not assemble, could not stage, could not do the ordinary organizational work that requires, because every time they gathered anywhere within sight of that hill, steel arrived without warning. You do not need to kill an army to stop it. You need only make it impossible for that army to be in the same place at the same time. That is what a 21-year-old with binoculars did to a panzer corps. And then came the part Hitler had not calculated at all. By ordering 4 panzer divisions west into the mouth of the American guns, he had pulled them out of the line at exactly the moment when the German position in Normandy required depth more than anything else. The attack failed. And now the divisions that had failed were sitting at the western end of a long, narrow pocket of ground with the Americans swinging north below them and the British and Canadians pressing south above them. The mouth of that pocket was near a town called Falaise. Through the second half of August, it closed. What had been designed as the operation to save the Camp Hem in France became the mechanism that destroyed the German army in France. Tens of thousands of men killed or captured, the roads out of the pocket packed with wrecked vehicles, dead horses, abandoned guns, and yes, artillery fire and air attack, pouring into that traffic jam for days. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge had said this would happen. He had told his superiors that pulling armor westward would feed it into the open and leave nothing behind it. He was ordered to proceed anyway, and he proceeded. And it happened exactly as he had said it would. On August 19, 1944, relieved of command and summoned back to Germany, von Kluge took his own life. The counterattack that was supposed to reach the sea instead opened the road to Paris. That is the shape of it. The thing Hitler ordered to save France is the thing that lost France, and the hinge it turned on was a bare rock and a radio. But there is one more chapter, because the German army did not accept the lesson of Mortain. It went back to school on it, and 4 months later it came again, and the Americans had added something new, the proximity fuse. Historians who rank the scientific achievements of that war generally place it just behind the atomic bomb and radar. It has none of their fame. It is a small metal nose cone, and if you saw one on a table, you would not look at it twice. Inside it was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. When the shell came within roughly 20 feet of a solid object, the reflected signal triggered the charge. An airburst. Understand what that changes, because it changes the oldest bargain in infantry warfare. A ground burst goes off when it hits the earth, and it throws most of its fragments outward and upward, which means a man flat in a hole is largely safe from it. That is the bargain every soldier since 1914 has made with artillery: dig, get low, get under the fragment cone, and take it. An airburst goes off above you and sprays fragments down. There is no posture that helps. A man flat in a foxhole is exposed from above. A man behind a stone wall is exposed from above. Short of solid overhead cover, real timber, and real earth, there is nothing a soldier can do with his body that improves his odds. Every instinct that had kept a veteran alive for 5 years became worthless in a single winter. Getting there had been an enormous engineering problem. The device had to be small enough to fit in the nose of a shell, and it had to survive being fired out of a cannon. Acceleration on the order of 20,000 times the force of gravity in the instant of launch. Vacuum tubes that could take that punishment did not exist when the war started. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, working with private firms like Crosley and Raytheon, built them. By 1945, procurement was approaching $500 million a year, with more than 100 manufacturers involved. The end product was a thing smaller than a soup can, costing a few dollars, that would reliably fire a 1942 vintage electronic circuit after being flung out of a gun barrel. And for nearly 2 years, the American Army in Europe was forbidden to use it. The Navy had been firing proximity fuses at Japanese aircraft since the cruiser Helena shot down a dive bomber off Guadalcanal on January 5, 1943. Over water, a dud sinks. Over land, a dud lands in a field, and a field can be walked by a German ordnance officer, and a German ordnance officer can take it apart. So the combined chiefs held the line. Not over land, not in Europe, not yet. They released use against the V-1 flying bombs over England in June 1944, because those were over water and coastline and the stakes were London. By mid-July, the coastal gun belt was destroying a large majority of the V-1s that reached it. But over the Western Front, the shell sat in ammunition dumps, forbidden. There is a story that the ban was broken by a single colonel on the morning of December 16, 1944, that Colonel Axelson of the 406th Field Artillery Group, hearing that cavalry troopers at Monschau were being overrun by the opening blow of the German Ardennes offensive, looked at his standing orders, looked at his ammunition, and authorized the fuses on his own responsibility. That account appears in the literature. It has not been firmly nailed down in the archival record, and I am not going to present it to you as settled fact, because the whole point of this story is that the truth was strange enough without decoration.
What is not in dispute is the sequence. The German offensive in the Ardennes began on December 16, 1944. Within days, Eisenhower had requested clearance to use the fuse over land, and before the end of that month, the restriction across the Western Front was gone.
2 years of caution, undone in the space of a single crisis. On the night of December 25 and the 26th, near the town of Echternach on the Sassauer River, Patton's Third Army used a proximity fuse shells against a German battalion attempting a night crossing. Patton wrote afterward to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Ordnance, that the new shell was devastating, and cited a figure of 702 Germans dead by actual count in that single mission. That figure comes from Patton's letter, and Patton was not a modest correspondent, so take the number as his claim rather than as a verified count. What is not in doubt is his conclusion. He wrote that when all armies had this shell, the tactics of land warfare would have to be rewritten. North of Echternach, on a long, open shoulder of high ground the Americans called Elsenborn Ridge, the older half of the system did the heavier work. The ridge sat east of the twin Belgian villages of Krinkel and Rocherath. Holding it were the 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter Robertson and, alongside them, the 99th Infantry Division, a green outfit that had never been in a serious fight, with the 1st Infantry Division coming up on the southern flank. Behind them, on the reverse slope where German observers could not see it, the Americans had massed one of the heaviest concentrations of artillery the United States Army assembled anywhere in Europe. Battalions from every division in the sector, plus corps artillery, pre-registered on every approach the Germans would have to use. The 12th SS Panzer Division led the northern half of the German offensive, and the northern half was the half that mattered. That was the shoulder that had to swing open for the whole plan to work. They went at that ridge uphill in daylight for the better part of 10 days. They never got up it. The attacks were broken apart on the slopes, and when it was over, the slopes were covered in German dead. The official Army history credits Elsenborn Ridge with inflicting the heaviest casualties of any single American defensive action of the Ardennes campaign on the units involved, and with forcing the entire northern shoulder of the offensive to reroute through terrain that slowed it fatally. The offensive that was meant to reach Antwerp reached the Meuse country and died. The reason was the artillery. After the war, the Americans and British sat down with captured German officers and asked them, at length and in private, what had actually beaten them. Not for newsreels, not for the public. Professional interrogators in quiet rooms, and later, German generals writing detailed studies for the U. Army's historical division about their own defeat. The resulting material runs to thousands of pages. Much of it is in the National Archives. Anyone can read it. And when those men were asked what had beaten them in the West, they did not usually name air power first, though they respected it and feared it. They did not usually name American infantry first, though by 1945 they had come to respect that too. They named the artillery. Over and over, with an uneasy insistence that recurs across the transcripts. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the Panzer-Lehr Division and who had been Rommel's chief of staff in the desert, described the bombardment that opened Operation Cobra in July 1944 as the worst experience of his career. He told his interrogators that a very large share of his personnel, he said 70%, had been put out of action in a single morning, and that his front line looked like the surface of the moon. Historians have since shown that the 70% figure was exaggerated. The division still had something on the order of 11,000 men and more than 30 tanks a week later. Bayerlein was a beaten commander, describing the worst day of his life, and beaten commanders round upward. But the number was never the point. The point is what he believed, and what he reported up his own chain of command, and what that belief did to the decisions made above him. 2 days after the bombing, Field Marshal von Kluge sent a courier ordering Bayerlein to hold his position. Bayerlein's reply has stayed in the German military literature ever since. He said his grenadiers, his engineers, and his tank crews were all still holding their ground. They were lying silent in their foxholes. They were dead. Only the dead could still hold that line. Bayerlein was captured by the Americans in April 1945 with the last remnants of Panzer-Lehr in the Ruhr pocket. He survived the war. He died in Würzburg in 1970. The picture his interrogations paint is consistent with what the rest of the captured officer corps said on the same subject. They had been outproduced. They had been out-organized. They had been out-communicated. They had been hit by a system of fire for which their doctrine had no answer, and they knew it while it was happening, and they could not fix it. So here is the honest answer to the question this whole story asks. It is not that American shells flew faster. They did not. It is not that American gunners were better. Man for man, they were not. And every honest American artilleryman would have told you so. It is that shells fired from different guns in different batteries, in different battalions, sometimes in different corps, had been trained to arrive in the same place in the same second, on demand, because a small group of officers in a poor schoolhouse in Oklahoma in the late 1920s decided that the target was the unit of artillery. And because an army of amateurs with 12 weeks of training had been handed printed cardboard strips that let them make that idea work at the level of a single gun. Now let me tell you what happened to the people in this story, because this is the part that matters most. Carlos Brewer, the major from Fort Sill who started it, was promoted through the war. He rose to Major General and commanded the 12th Armored Division in training in the United States. And then he was told he was too old for a combat command. He was in his 50s. He had a general's star, a safe assignment, and a career that had already given him more than most soldiers ever get. He gave the star back. According to the Field Artillery School's own histories, Carlos Brewer voluntarily reverted from Major General to Colonel in order to command a field artillery group in 7th Army in Europe. He took a demotion, a real one, in rank and pay and status, for the chance to go where his idea was being used. He wanted to see it work in a real war. He saw it. He came home. He died in 1976, and almost nobody outside the artillery branches ever heard his name. Orlando Ward, who built the Fire Direction Center with him, commanded the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia, was relieved by Patton after McNassie, came home and served out the war running the Field Artillery School. He died in 1972. The men who worked out the Graphic firing table, the piece of printed cardboard that made all of it fast enough to matter, never became famous officers. Their names appear in school histories and technical manuals and almost nowhere else. They were the kind of men the American Army had a great many of in those years and did not particularly know it. The women at Aberdeen went home. Some of them went on to program ENIAC. Most of them went into ordinary lives, and it took historians the better part of half a century to go back and find out who they had been. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz, the older observer, the man from Nebraska, who had lain beside Weiss on that rock for 6 days. Charles Bartz was killed in action on October 31, 1944, inside Germany. 2.5 months after Hill 314, he was 26 years old. He is buried in Lincoln Memorial Park in Lincoln, Nebraska. That is the sentence I would ask you to sit with, if you sit with any of them. He survived the thing that should have killed him, the thing they gave him a medal for, the thing that is in the history books. And then the war just kept going the way it did, and it took him in October in a place almost nobody remembers. Captain Reynold Erickson, the infantry officer who took command of the hill when no one senior to him could reach it, survived the war and lived quietly afterward. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry received the Presidential Unit Citation. Erickson and several of the company commanders received the Distinguished Service Cross. Weiss and Bartz, the two men whose radio had made the difference, were decorated for what they did on that summit. And Robert Weiss went home. He was 22 when the war ended. He had been on Hill 314 for 6 days in August 1944 and had directed the fire that helped stop a Panzer Corps. And then he came back to Indiana, and then he went out to Oregon, and he became a tax attorney. He founded a law firm in Portland that is still in practice today. He raised a family. He did the ordinary and unglamorous and entirely honorable work of an American professional life for the next 50 years, and if you had looked him up in the phone book, you would have found nothing more interesting than his name and the word attorney. He did not write about the Hill for a very long time. When he finally did, a book called Fire Mission. He was an old man, and he said in the preface that the reason he wrote it was that the men who had been with him up there deserved someone to write down what had happened. Not himself, them. Robert Weiss died in Portland in 2017. He was 94 years old, and that is the shape of nearly all of it. Most of the men who ran the American artillery system, the thousands of Fire Direction Center computers, the radio operators, the liaison lieutenants, the survey teams, the drivers, the loaders, came home and went back to jobs that had nothing to do with any of this. They became accountants, teachers, mechanics, salesmen, farmers. They coached Little League. They fixed the porch on Saturdays. They sat in church on Sunday next to men who had done similar things and never talked about it either. 10 years after the war, in the phone book of any American town, you would not have found a single one of them listed under anything more interesting than his trade. The German officers, writing their private assessments of what had beaten them, kept reaching for a particular vocabulary: methodical, systematic, industrial. What they were circling without quite saying it was this: they had not been beaten by an enemy trying to be better than them at the art of artillery. They had been beaten by an enemy that made the art of artillery irrelevant. The German master gunner, the man who could do ballistics in his head, who could walk his shells onto a target by feel and craft and 20 years of accumulated judgment, had been replaced on the American side of the line by a network that did not depend on any single man being brilliant. It was not noble. It was not a craft. It was a factory laid over a battlefield, and it worked. That is the part their professional tradition could not forgive. And in the memoirs, they mostly did not try. They wrote that it worked, and they left it there. So when a captured German officer told his interrogators that American artillery was impossible to survive, he was not being dramatic. He was making a technical statement, and he was very nearly right. But it was never the shells. It was a room with a map board, a strip of printed cardboard, a young woman at a desk in Maryland with a mechanical calculator, spending 20 hours on the flight path of one shell she would never see fired, and a 21-year-old from Indiana lying behind a wall of loose stones on a bald hill in Normandy, dying of thirst, with a radio going flat in his hands, reading numbers, keeping his voice flat.